What happens when a single night shatters every boundary? Grace Oni has it all. A billion-dollar tech empire, a penthouse overlooking the Lagos skyline, and the respect of an entire nation. But she also has a void that wealth cannot fill, the silence of a childless home after 3 failed marriages. One celebratory night, too much champagne, and a moment of reckless vulnerability with the one man she should never have touched, her young Gateman, Emmanuel. Now, a scandal is brewing that could topple her empire. The world will call it madness. The board will call it a liability. But what do you call a miracle that arrives in the most forbidden package? When the unthinkable happens, will she choose her legacy or her heart? The Lagos sun, a relentless orb of burnished gold, had finally begun its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured grounds of the Oni estate. From the back seat of her silent-running electric SUV, Grace Oni watched the cityscape blur past, a tapestry of gleaming glass and weathered concrete. At 45, she had built an empire from a single stubborn idea and a small loan from her father. Oni Technologies was now a household name across Africa, but tonight, the victory felt hollow. Her phone, a sleek, black slate, buzzed incessantly against the calfskin interior. Messages of congratulations for the successful launch of Apex, their new fintech platform, scrolled across the screen. Each vibration was a tiny, electric reminder of her achievement, and yet, the silence inside the car was deafening. "Long day, madam?" The voice came from the front seat. It was Emmanuel, her gateman for the evening shift. His deep, calm tone was a familiar sound, a steady anchor in the whirlwind of her life. "The longest, Emmanuel," she replied, allowing a sliver of weariness to seep into her voice. She rarely did that with staff, but a good one. Apex exceeded all projections. "Nagato," he said softly, "you have worked hard. You deserve to celebrate." Celebrate. The word echoed in the plush silence. Celebrate with whom? Her last husband, Tund, had left 2 years ago, the silence of their childless home finally driving a permanent wedge between them. Her friends were either jealous competitors or sycophants. Her family saw only the billionaire, not the woman. The car glided to a stop at the imposing wrought iron gates of her Ikoyi residence. Emmanuel was out in a fluid movement, his uniform crisp, his posture ramrod straight. He swung the gates open with a practiced hand. As the SUV rolled through, their eyes met briefly in the side mirror. His were a warm, intelligent brown, and for a fleeting, absurd moment, Grace felt seen. Not as CEO Grace Oni, but just Grace. The launch party was a masterpiece of modern Nigerian opulence, held in the penthouse of a 5-star hotel. The air hummed with the chatter of Lagos's elite. Men in bespoke agbatas and Italian suits, women in dazzling couture ankara gowns and sequin dresses. The space was a testament to contemporary African design. Walls clad in intricate, laser-cut panels inspired by Yoruba attire patterns, low-slung sofas in deep indigo velvet, and stunning, oversized sculptures by Bruce Onobrekpia lit by discreet spotlights. Grace moved through the crowd, a vision in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, her smile a perfectly calibrated tool. She accepted congratulations, gave sound bites to the press, and clinked glasses of champagne. But with each flute of Veuve Clicquot, the polished facade began to crack. The laughter started to sound tinny, the conversations repetitive. She saw the sideways glances, the whispers she knew all too well. Poor Grace. All this and no one to leave it to. The loneliness, a cold, familiar stone in her gut, began to thaw under the flood of alcohol, turning into a raw, aching need. She drank to drown the memory of 3 gynecologists, on 3 separate occasions, using the same clinical tone. Unexplained infertility. She drank to forget the look in Tun's eyes the day he packed his bags. "I need a son, Grace. It's not your fault." She drank until the world became a soft-focused blur of light and noise. "Madam, I think it is time." The voice was a low rumble, cutting through the haze. Emmanuel was suddenly beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. She hadn't even seen him arrive. The event security must have called him as her designated driver. Emmanuel? She slurred, leaning into him. The party. It's just getting good. The best parties know when to end, he said, his voice firm yet gentle. He expertly took the champagne flute from her limp fingers and guided her towards the elevator, his hand a steadying pressure on her elbow. She didn't resist. The ride down in the elevator was a silent, spinning vortex. The ride home was a dark blur. She remembered stumbling on the steps to her penthouse door, his arm catching her, the hard muscle of his forearm a shock against her skin. Inside, her home was a sanctuary of cool, minimalist design. The sprawling open-plan living room featured polished concrete floors covered with a huge, plush rug from Ethiopia. A massive, sectional sofa in cream boucle faced the floor-to-ceiling windows, and a single, dramatic painting by Victor Ihikamanor dominated one wall. But tonight, the beauty felt sterile, empty. "I can manage from here," she mumbled, fumbling with the clasp of her diamond necklace. But her fingers were useless. Emmanuel, with a quiet "Permit me, madam," stepped behind her. His fingers, surprisingly deft, worked the delicate clasp. The brush of his skin against the nape of her neck sent an unexpected jolt through her system, a live wire in the numb emptiness. She turned to thank him, to dismiss him, but the words died in her throat. The alcohol, the loneliness, the years of touch-starved existence converged into a single, reckless impulse. The chasm between CEO and Gateman, between billionaire and employee, vanished in the face of a more profound, human need. She reached out, her hand resting on his chest. She felt the solid thud of his heart beneath the rough cotton of his uniform. "Stay," she whispered, the word a desperate, broken thing. He froze, his eyes wide with shock. "Madam, Grace, I cannot." "Please," she said, and it was the plea of a woman, not a CEO. "Don't leave me alone in this quiet house." For a long moment, he was a statue, a battle raging behind his eyes. Then something softened. He saw not the powerful titan of industry, but a profoundly lonely woman, shimmering with vulnerability in the moonlight streaming through the windows. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, a slow, grave gesture. What followed was a blur of tangled limbs and silenced inhibitions on her vast, cream-colored sofa. It was frantic, clumsy, and fueled by a desperation that had little to do with him and everything to do with the echoing void in her life. Afterward, as dawn painted the Lagos skyline in streaks of rose and gold, she fell into a deep, champagne-soaked slumber, his arm a heavy, unfamiliar weight across her waist. When the hammering in her head woke her a few hours later, the reality of what she had done crashed down with the force of a physical blow. Shame, hot and acute, washed over her. She carefully extracted herself, leaving Emmanuel sleeping peacefully on the expensive fabric. His features softened in sleep, looking far younger than his 28 years. She fled to her ensuite bathroom, a temple of marble and chrome, and leaned over the double vanity, her stomach churning. She met her own horrified gaze in the mirror. The billionaire CEO, the woman who commanded boardrooms. She had just slept with her gateman. It was a catastrophic error in judgment, a scandal of epic proportions waiting to happen. She would handle it, she decided, her CEO instincts kicking in. A significant, discreet financial settlement, a transfer to another one of her properties, a firmly re-established boundary. She took a shuddering breath, already drafting the conversation in her head. It was a mistake, terrible, regrettable lapse, nothing more. But as she stood there, the first faint wave of nausea rose in her throat, a sensation she hadn't felt in 25 years. She dismissed it as hangover. She had no way of knowing it was the first quiet tremor of an earthquake that was about to shatter her perfectly ordered world. The settlement package was prepared with clinical efficiency. A generous 8-figure sum, a glowing letter of recommendation, and a management position at a subsidiary in Port Harcourt, far from the Lagos spotlight. Grace had it all printed and placed in a crisp, cream-colored folder. She would be firm but fair. It was the only way to restore order. But for 3 days, Emmanuel was on leave, visiting his family in Jos. The delay frayed her nerves. She found herself watching the gatehouse camera feed on her phone, a habit she'd never had before. She saw him return on a Sunday evening, carrying a small travel bag, and her heart performed a ridiculous, nervous flutter. On Monday morning, she waited until he had completed his perimeter check. Dressed in a severe, but elegant, Alexander McQueen dress, she walked out to the gatehouse, the folder feeling like a lead weight in her hand. He was polishing the already gleaming gate fixtures, his back to her. "Good morning, madame," he said without turning, as if he had a sixth sense for her presence. "Emmanuel, a word inside, please." Her voice was cooler than she intended. He followed her into the main house, his work boots silent on the polished concrete. She led him not to the intimate living room, but to the formal study, a room dominated by a massive desk made from a single slab of reclaimed Irako wood. She took her seat behind it, the power dynamic physically reestablished. She slid the folder across the desk. "This is for you, a token of my appreciation for your discretion and for your service. It includes a new position in Port Harcourt. I believe it's a significant step up." Emmanuel didn't touch the folder. He stood calmly, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady. He looked not at the package, but at her. "Thank you, madam," he said, his voice even, "but I cannot accept." Grace blinked. "This was not in the script. It's a very generous offer, Emmanuel. The salary is triple what you earn here. It's an opportunity." "It is, but my life is here in Lagos. My master's program begins at the University of Lagos next semester. I have saved for it." He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. "And I do not need payment for discretion. What happened was a private matter." Frustration, sharp and hot, prickled at her. "This is not a negotiation. It's a necessary relocation. Is it necessary because of what happened? Or because my presence now makes you uncomfortable?" The directness of the question struck her like a physical blow. He wasn't being insolent. He was being profoundly honest. It unnerved her. Both, she admitted, her CEO mask slipping for a second. "It was a mistake. We both know that. This," she tapped the folder, "is the cleanest way to handle it." He finally picked up the folder, not to open it, but to hold it. "A mistake," he repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "For you, perhaps. For me, it was not." He placed the folder back on the desk, squarely in the center. "I will not go to Port Harcourt, and I will not take your money. If you wish to sack me, I will accept that. But I will not run from a situation I played a part in creating." He gave a slight, formal nod. "By your leave, madam." And before she could formulate a response, he turned and walked out, leaving her staring at the rejected folder, her perfectly laid plans in tatters. The following weeks were an exercise in surreal tension. Emmanuel remained at his post. He opened the gate every morning with the same quiet efficiency. He was neither familiar nor resentful. He was just Emmanuel. But Grace found herself hyper-aware of him. She noticed the way the morning sun caught the line of his jaw, the quiet confidence in his stride, the dog-eared philosophy textbook he read during his breaks. Nietzsche's "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." Meanwhile, her body began to betray her in strange ways. The nausea returned, not just in the morning but in dizzying waves throughout the day. Her breasts were tender. A profound, bone-deep fatigue settled over her, immune to coffee or willpower. She attributed it all to stress. The scandalous secret, the failed negotiation with Emmanuel, the relentless pressure of work. It was during a brutal, all-hands board meeting that the truth finally refused to be ignored. They were debating the Q3 projections, numbers swimming before her eyes. The scent of Bola's strong coffee, which usually invigorated her, suddenly made her stomach lurch violently. She excused herself, barely making it to the private restroom adjacent to her office before she was violently, messily sick. She leaned against the cool marble wall, trembling. And then she remembered. The date. Her cycle, once as predictable as the Lagos traffic, was now weeks late. A cold dread, entirely different from the heat of shame, trickled down her spine. That evening, she drove herself to a small, discreet pharmacy in a neighborhood where no one knew her. She bought 3 different brands of pregnancy tests, her hands shaking as she paid. Back in her pristine bathroom, she followed the instructions with the focused precision of a lab technician. The wait was an eternity. She couldn't look. She paced the length of the bathroom, past the freestanding tub and the rain shower, her reflection in the multiple mirrors a portrait of sheer panic. Finally, she forced herself to look. 2 lines. On all 3. Positive, positive, positive. The world tilted on its axis. The polished tiles beneath her feet felt insubstantial. She sank onto the closed lid of the toilet, the plastic sticks clattering from her numb fingers onto the floor. Pregnant. At 45. After a lifetime of being told it was impossible. The father was her 28-year-old Gateman. A hysterical laugh, sharp and brittle, escaped her lips. It was a cosmic joke. The one thing she had wanted more than any business success, the deep, aching void that no amount of money or power could fill, was now being granted in the most socially catastrophic, personally complicated way imaginable. Her first instinct was one of pure, unadulterated terror. The board, the tabloids, her family, the shareholders. It would be a firestorm from which her reputation might never recover. But then, another feeling, small and tenuous, began to unfurl beneath the panic. It was a flicker of something else, something like wonder. She placed a trembling hand on her still flat stomach. Beneath the layers of fear and social anxiety, a miracle, wild and improbable, was taking root. She looked at her reflection again. The terrified CEO was still there. But now she was also someone else. Someone she never thought she'd be. A mother. The sterile white of the private clinic's examination room felt like a vacuum, sealing Grace off from the world she knew. Dr. Adebayo, a woman whose calm demeanor had guided Grace through a decade of disappointing results, now stared at the ultrasound screen with an expression of profound shock. "Grace, I don't know what to say," she murmured, the wand moving gently over the conductive gel on Grace's abdomen. "There it is, a gestational sac, perfectly implanted, and based on your HCG levels. This is very real." Grace lay on the examination table, her designer blouse pushed up, her stomach exposed. She felt utterly vulnerable, her billionaire's armor useless against the cold reality of the medical equipment and the technician's quiet awe. She couldn't bring herself to look at the screen. Confirming the pregnancy was one thing. Seeing it was another level of terrifying finality. "It's impossible," Grace whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You told me it was impossible. Medicine deals in probabilities, not certainties," Dr. Adebayo said softly, finally turning to look at her. "Sometimes the body has a plan of its own. At your age, this is remarkable. But Grace, we need to talk about the risks. Advanced maternal age, the potential for chromosomal abnormalities." The doctor's voice became a distant hum, a checklist of perils. Grace only tuned back in for the final, inevitable question. "And the father? We'll need a full medical history. Age, genetic background." Grace's throat tightened. She looked at the ceiling, at the acoustic tiles that seemed to press down on her. "He's 28, she said, the words hanging in the sterile air. Dr. Adebayo's professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. A flicker of surprise, then a rapid recalculation. "I see. Well, that mitigates some factors from a genetic standpoint." She cleared her throat. "I'll have my nurse put together a package for you. Prenatal vitamins, a strict dietary plan, a schedule for scans and tests. You are now a high-priority patient, Grace. High priority. Not a CEO. A vessel. A high-risk geriatric pregnancy." The drive home was a blur. The vibrant, chaotic energy of Lagos. The hawkers weaving through traffic. The vibrant Ankara prints of market-goers. The constant, pulsating rhythm of life felt like a mockery. She was trapped in a silent, glass bubble, hurtling towards a cliff. Back in her penthouse, the silence was deafening. She stood in the middle of her vast living room, the ultrasound photo, a grainy, black and white blob, held loosely in her hand. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. 20 floors below, life went on. Up here, her life had just been split into a before and an after. Her phone buzzed. Bola. The board was expecting a final review of the Apex rollout in an hour. The thought of sitting in that glass-walled conference room, discussing market saturation and user engagement, while this secret grew inside her, was unbearable. Felt obscene. She had to make a decision. Termination was the logical, clean corporate solution. It would erase the problem, preserve her legacy, and maintain the pristine order of her world. She could schedule it quietly in London or New York. No one would ever need to know. But as she thought it, a protective, ferocious instinct she never knew she possessed surged through her. It was visceral, a primal roar that drowned out the whispers of boardrooms and tabloids. This is my child. It was then, gazing down at the city, that she saw him. Emmanuel was in the courtyard below, not in his uniform, but in a simple pair of trousers and a t-shirt, watering the lush, tropical plants that bordered the property. He moved with a quiet, inherent grace, tending to the living things in his care. He had refused her money, refused to run. He had stood his ground with a dignity she rarely encountered in the cutthroat world of business. He was part of this. However complicated, however impossible, he was the father. And he deserved to know. Summoning a courage that dwarfed any boardroom battle, she sent a text, not to her assistant, but directly to his phone. Emmanuel, can you come up to the main house? Now, we need to talk. 15 minutes later, he stood in her living room again. He had changed back into his uniform, but his expression was the same as before, calm, steady, waiting. Close the door, please, Grace said, her back still to him. He did. The soft click of the latch echoed in the spacious room. She turned around, clutching the ultrasound photo behind her back. She didn't offer him a seat. The formality of the study felt wrong for this conversation. I have a situation, she began, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. A medical situation. His brow furrowed in immediate concern. Are you unwell, madam? Not unwell. She took a sharp, steadying breath and forced the words out. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't the shocked, judgmental silence she had feared from her board. It was a deep, absorbing silence. Emmanuel's eyes widened, but he didn't flinch, didn't step back. He simply absorbed the seismic information, his gaze dropping to her stomach for a fleeting second before returning to her face. I see, he said, his voice low and incredibly gentle. The doctor confirmed it today, she continued, the words tumbling out now. It's high risk. Because of my age. There are a multitude of complications. Socially, professionally. She was rambling, trying to box the miracle into a problem to be managed. Emmanuel took a single step forward, his intense focus entirely on her. Grace, he said, and the use of her first name, spoken with such reverence, stopped her spiral. The child. Is it well? The question was so simple, so fundamental, that it shattered the last of her defenses. He hadn't asked about paternity, about scandal, about money. His first and only concern was the life they had created. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. Slowly, she brought the crumpled ultrasound photo from behind her back and held it out. He crossed the room and took it from her, his work-roughened fingers handling the slip of paper as if it were the most precious artifact. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at her, and his eyes were shining with unshed tears. A child, he breathed, the word full of wonder. After all this time, it is God's blessing. He looked from the grainy image to her face, his gaze holding a new, profound responsibility. What do you want to do? It was the question she had been asking herself. And looking at him, standing in her modern, sterile palace, holding the proof of their impossible, life-altering connection, Grace Oni knew her answer. I want to have this baby, she whispered. A slow, beautiful smile spread across Emmanuel's face, transforming his features. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. Then we will, he said, with a quiet certainty that felt like an unshakable foundation. Whatever comes, we will face it. Together. The decision, once spoken aloud, became a tangible thing in the room, solid and immense. Grace watched as Emmanuel's gaze shifted from the grainy ultrasound image to her face, the initial wonder in his eyes hardening into a fierce, protective resolve. The "we" he had uttered was not a suggestion, but a declaration. First, he said, his voice low and practical, cutting through the emotional haze, "You need to sit. You look pale." He guided her gently to the large, cream boucle sofa, his touch firm yet respectful. He then walked to her kitchen, a sleek space of custom cabinetry and marble countertops, and returned with a glass of water. "The doctor will have given you instructions." "What are they?" The sheer normality of the question was grounding. Grace found herself reciting Dr. Adebayo's list: prenatal vitamins, specific foods to avoid, reduce stress, a strict schedule of appointments. Emmanuel listened, his focus absolute, as if she were briefing him on a critical security detail. "I will handle it," he stated simply when she finished. "I will get the vitamins. I will speak with the cook about your diet." "Emmanuel, that's not necessary. I have staff. And I am your gateman," he interrupted, the title holding a new, layered meaning. "It is my duty to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone on this property. That includes you. And now it especially includes the baby." He said the last word with a slight hesitation, as if testing the sound of it. He left shortly after, the ultrasound photo carefully placed on her coffee table. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer empty. It was charged with the echo of his promise. "We will face it. Together." The first test of that resolve came faster than she could have imagined. A week later, a sleek, black car pulled up to her gate. Tund, her third ex-husband, emerged, dressed in an impeccably tailored agbada, his expression one of smug concern. He had heard a wild rumor through the domestic staff grapevine and had come to check on her. Grace had him shown into the living room. She sat, poised on the edge of her sofa, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "Grace," Tund began, his eyes sweeping over her with a familiar, patronizing air. "I hear you've been unwell, and that there's talk about you and that boy who guards your gate." He shook his head, a mock-tragic look on his face. "It is beneath you, Grace, this kind of scandal. For a woman of your stature, people are saying you've lost your mind, that you're desperate." Before Grace could form a cutting retort, a presence filled the doorway to the terrace. Emmanuel stood there, having entered through the garden. He wasn't in his uniform, but in a simple, clean pair of jeans and a white t-shirt, a deliberate choice that stripped away the employer-employee dynamic. He held a small tray with a pot of ginger tea and a single cup, a silent, powerful assertion of his new role. "Your tea, Grace," he said, his voice calm and resonant in the spacious room. He placed the tray on the table in front of her, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Then he turned to Tund. "Sir," he said, with a nod that was not quite deference, but simple acknowledgement. "The madam needs her rest." The doctor was very clear. Stress is not good for her condition. Tund stared, his mouth slightly agape. The sheer audacity of the interruption, the intimate use of her first name, the clear reference to her pregnancy. It was a brazen reclaiming of the narrative. "Your condition," Tund spluttered, his gaze darting between Grace's defiant face and Emmanuel's impassive one. "So it's true? This is madness." Emmanuel didn't flinch. He stood beside Grace's chair, a silent sentinel. "It is a blessing," he corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And it is a private family matter. The gate is that way, sir." The dismissal was so absolute, so quietly powerful, that Tund was momentarily stunned into silence. He looked at Grace, who met his gaze with a cool, steady look she hadn't felt in weeks. He had come to shame her, to reassert his dominance over the barren woman he had left. Instead, he found her protected, claimed, and radiating a strength that had nothing to do with her bank account. He left without another word, his pride in tatters. When the front door closed, Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked up at Emmanuel. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied, his gaze soft but unwavering. "You are carrying my child. That makes you my responsibility. My family, and I protect my family." He gestured to the tea. "Drink. It will help with the nausea." In that moment, the last vestiges of her resistance crumbled. He wasn't a problem to be managed. He was an ally, partner, and for the first time in her adult life, Grace Oni did not feel alone in her fight. Later that evening, she found him not at the gatehouse, but at the large Irako wood table in her dining room, her laptop open before him. He was researching prenatal nutrition plans, exercise regimens for high-risk pregnancies, the best cardiologists and obstetricians in the country to form a specialized team. He looked up as she entered. "We need to be prepared," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for the Gateman to be planning the medical care for the CEO's baby. Their baby. Grace pulled out a chair and sat beside him. "Show me," she said, and together, in the warm glow of the pendant light, surrounded by the sleek, modern beauty of a home that was finally beginning to feel lived in, they began to build their fortress, one researched fact, one shared look, one unshakable promise at a time. The world outside was already sharpening its knives, but inside, a different kind of power was being forged, not of money or status, but of a united front. The fortress, however, could not hold back the tide. The leak came from a disgruntled former member of her domestic staff, paid handsomely by a rival tabloid. The headline was splashed across the front page of the Lagos Gossip in bold, screaming type: "Billionaire CEO's boys' quarters baby bombshell. Gatecrasher dad for menopause mum?" Grace saw it on her phone as her driver navigated the morning traffic to the office. The world seemed to slow, the honking cars and bustling streets fading into a dull roar. The article was vicious, laced with innuendo and classist venom, painting her as a desperate, menopausal woman and Emmanuel as a cunning gold digger. By the time she reached the soaring glass tower of Oni Technologies, a small crowd of reporters was already gathered at the entrance. Flashbulbs popped like gunfire. Her security team formed a phalanx around her, but she could still hear the shouted questions slicing through the air. "Ms. Oni, is it true the father is your employee? Are you expecting a child, Grace? Will you be stepping down from the board?" She rode the elevator up in a cold, silent fury, her knuckles white as she gripped her briefcase. The moment the doors opened onto the executive floor, the tension was a physical presence. Her assistants looked up with pitying eyes. Bola was waiting for her outside her office, the tabloid crumpled in her hand. "Grace," Bola said, her voice tight, "the board is demanding an emergency meeting. In 10 minutes. The boardroom was an icebox. The 12 men and women seated around the massive, polished table were not the allies she had built a company with. They were a tribunal. The newspaper lay in the center of the table like an accusation. "Grace," began Chief Okafor, the eldest board member, his voice dripping with condescension, "we are trying to understand the situation, this liaison with a member of your domestic staff, and the resulting condition presents an unacceptable reputational risk." Bola, to her credit, tried to intervene. "Grace's personal life is just that, personal. Her performance has never been better. The Apex launch was a triumph. Performance is not the issue." Another director snapped. "It's about perception. Our stock is down 3% in pre-market trading. Our international partners are sending frantic emails. They're asking if we've lost our minds. A Gateman, Grace? At your age? It reeks of instability, of poor judgment." The word judgment hung in the air, the ultimate condemnation in the corporate world. They dissected her life with surgical, merciless precision. Her age, his class, the sordid nature of it all. They didn't say madness again, but she could feel the word vibrating in the air between them. Grace sat through it, her back ramrod straight, her face a mask of calm. But inside, she was crumbling. These were the people she had fought alongside, celebrated with. Now they saw her only as a liability, a scandal to be contained. The meeting ended with a unanimous recommendation that she take an indefinite leave of absence for the health of the company and herself. It was a polite coup. She returned to her office, the door clicking shut behind her with a sound of finality. The panoramic view of Lagos, once a symbol of her dominion, now seemed to mock her. She had built this, and they could take it from her with a whisper campaign and a plummeting stock price. She didn't know how long she stood there before a soft knock came at the door. It was her young, timid assistant, Neka. "Madam," Neka whispered, her eyes wide with fear and sympathy. "There is someone here for you. He's at the private rear entrance," he insisted. Grace's heart stuttered. She knew. She took the private elevator down to the basement garage. And there, standing beside her waiting car, was Emmanuel. He wasn't in his uniform, but in a simple, well-fitting pair of trousers and a clean shirt. He held a small, insulated flask. He didn't speak. He simply opened his arms. And Grace Oni, the titan of industry, the woman who had just been publicly shamed and professionally dethroned, walked into the embrace of her Gateman. She buried her face in his shoulder, and the tears she had held back in the boardroom finally came, hot and silent, soaking his shirt. He held her, his grip strong and sure, a rock in the churning sea of her disgrace. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just held her, letting her break. When her sobs subsided, he gently guided her into the back seat of the car and got in beside her, dismissing her driver with a quiet word. He poured a steaming, fragrant liquid from the flask into a cup. It was a special ginger and lemon tea his mother made. "Drink," he said softly. "For the baby." She took the cup, her hands shaking. "The board. They've asked me to step aside," she choked out. "They called it a lapse in judgment." Emmanuel looked at her, his eyes holding no pity, only a deep, simmering anger on her behalf. "Their judgment is based on fear and small minds," he said, his voice low and firm. "They see a scandal. I see the woman who built an empire with her own hands, who is now brave enough to embrace a miracle that defies all their small rules." He placed a hand, warm and steady, on her stomach. "This is not a lapse in judgment, Grace. This is your life, and it is more important than any boardroom." As the car pulled out into the Lagos dusk, Grace leaned her head against the window, physically and emotionally exhausted. But for the first time since seeing the headline, the cold knot of dread in her stomach began to loosen. The world had thrown its worst at her. It had taken her reputation, her position, her dignity. But as she looked at Emmanuel's profile, strong and resolute in the fading light, she realized it had not taken everything. It had not taken him. And the tiny, growing life inside her was a truth no tabloid could ever touch. The battle for her public legacy might be lost, but the war for her private happiness had just begun. The indefinite leave of absence was a gilded cage. Her official email was forwarded to Bola. Her calendar, once a mosaic of power lunches and international summits, was wiped clean, replaced by a single, repeating appointment: prenatal care. The silence in her penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet of a battlefield after a defeat. The tabloids, having feasted on the initial scandal, now circled for a different kind of story: the downfall. They published grainy photos of her leaving the clinic, speculating on her health, her mental state, her isolation. They dubbed her the lonely heiress, painting a picture of a woman drowning in regret. But the picture was a lie. Emmanuel had quietly, completely moved in, not as a lover in the grand, romantic sense, but as a partner in the trenches. He converted the spacious, airy guest room, the one with the best light, into a nursery and his study. His few possessions, his books, his carving tools, a simple wooden cross, found a place next to her curated luxury. The clash was no longer jarring. It was becoming a new, integrated whole. One afternoon, a wave of crippling nausea left her curled on the bathroom floor, the cold marble a relief against her feverish cheek. She hadn't called for him, too proud, too weary. But he appeared in the doorway, his presence a quiet constant. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply knelt, gathered her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to the bed. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead and sat on the edge of the mattress, reading to her from one of his philosophy texts in his calm, deep voice until the sickness passed and she fell into an exhausted sleep. He was her shield against the outside world. He screened all calls. He managed the few staff who remained loyal, his quiet authority brooking no gossip. He became her personal chef, preparing the bland, nutrient-rich meals her stomach could tolerate. He was her researcher, her logistician, her calm in the storm. And in the quiet moments, they talked. Really talked. She learned about his village in Jos, about his father who was a carpenter, about his dream to teach philosophy. He, in turn, asked her about her first company, the thrill of that initial public offering, the sting of her first major failure. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw an architect, a builder of dreams, and he was fascinated by the blueprint of her mind. One evening, they were in the living room. Grace was attempting to read a corporate report, a futile effort to feel connected to her old life. Emmanuel was on the floor, sanding a small, beautifully carved wooden rattle, the scent of cedar filling the air. The setting sun cast long, golden beams across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He looked up at her, his gaze thoughtful. "They took your company from you because of this," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. He gestured to her rounded stomach, now visibly curving beneath her silk tunic. Grace put the report down, the words a blur. "They took it because they see this as a weakness, an instability." "A weakness?" Emmanuel gave a short, dismissive laugh. He held up the half-finished rattle. "They sit in their boardrooms and talk about building legacies with paper and stock prices. They have no idea what it means to build a legacy with flesh and blood and love." He set the rattle down and looked at her, his eyes intense. "You have spent your life building a kingdom for others to live in. Now you are building a soul. Which is the greater work?" The question landed in the center of her heart, appending everything. She had been mourning the loss of her throne. He was pointing her toward a different, more profound creation. A few days later, a courier delivered a heavy, embossed envelope. It was the formal, legal document from the board, outlining the terms of her voluntary severance and buyout of her shares. It was a king's ransom, designed to silence her forever. It was the final nail in the coffin of her corporate life. She held the thick packet, the weight of it feeling like the weight of her past. She expected to feel a fresh wave of grief. Instead, she felt a strange, quiet release. She walked out to the terrace where Emmanuel was watering the plants. The humid Lagos air was thick with the scent of blooming frangipani. She held up the envelope. "This is it," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The end of Grace Oni, CEO." Emmanuel put down the watering can and came to stand beside her, looking not at the envelope, but at her face. "And the beginning of who?" She looked out over the skyline, at the glittering tower that bore her name, now a monument to a life she no longer lived. Then she looked down at her stomach, at the new life kicking insistently within her. She placed a hand over the spot, feeling the potent, undeniable truth of it. She turned to him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in weeks. It was a smile not of victory, but of discovery. "The beginning of grace," she said simply. "Just grace. And a mother." He took her hand, his rough carpenter's palm warm against her soft skin. "It is a good name," he said. "A strong name." And in that moment, surrounded by the trappings of a life she was leaving behind, Grace knew he was right. The world had tried to bury her, not realizing it was watering a seed. A new life was growing, not just in her womb, but in her soul. The fortress walls had fallen, and in their place, a garden was beginning to bloom.